All right, guys, this is exciting. So today we're going to talk about the question, hasn't science disproved Christianity? If you don't know who I am, doesn't matter. I'm not important. We got too much to cover. So you can ask me all about myself later or never at all. No problem. Okay, so it is a pleasure to have been invited to speak to you. I find this to be a particularly fascinating topic, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. So there is a popular idea in today's culture, especially that science, when you really understand it, makes belief in God not only unnecessary, but even silly or laughable. In fact, surveys of your peers from across the US reflect the pervasiveness of that idea. When asked why young people have rejected faith or never considered it seriously in the first place, their top answer is there's no scientific evidence for God. Second is similar, but they cite the theories of chemical and biological evolution as undermining their faith. And then third, top answer, a distant third actually, is the problem of pain, suffering, and evil in the world. But clearly, science has played a significant role in eroding many people's confidence in God. And this perceived tension between faith and science isn't new. It traces back to the late 19th century. So Charles Darwin, when he published On the Origin of the Species, his seminal work, that was 1859. And before that, it was very difficult to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. But Darwin's publication radicalized a lot of people, and it started a profound shift in scientific thinking around the world. And out of that came two very influential books. These books offered very bold reinterpretations of science's history. The titles of the books kind of tell the whole story. One was A History of the Conflict Between Science and Religion, and another was The History of the Warfare Between Science and Theology. The authors of these books, whose names you don't need to know, they framed science's entire past primarily as a battle against religious belief. Thankfully, come on in, guys. Thankfully, modern historians of science have thoroughly debunked this narrative. Unfortunately, many people, though, still thoughtlessly accept the false narrative that science and religion are somehow locked in a fight to the death. Let's see if we can shed some light on that issue. In the 1940s, there were two prominent scholars from Cambridge University, Joseph Needham and Herbert Butterfield, and they posed a critical question. Why did the scientific revolution, this systematic, organized approach to studying nature, why did it emerge in a specific time and a specific place? Now, that time in question is roughly 1500 to 1700, a period known as the scientific revolution. Thanks to the work done by Needham and Butterfield, they coined that term, scientific revolution. So 1500 to 1700, and the place where this happened was Western Europe. So the scientific revolution spanned from Copernicus to Newton, and it marked not only an extraordinary surge in scientific discovery, but also the formalization of the scientific method that we know and use today. Let's consider this insight from Peter Hodgson. He is a historian of science at Oxford University. He had this to say: if we think about what is needed for the viable birth of science, we see first of all that it needs a fairly well-developed society so that some of its members can spend most of their time just thinking about the world without the constant preoccupation of finding the next meal. It needs some simple technology so that the apparatus required for experiments can be constructed. There must also be a system of writing so that the results can be recorded and sent to other scientists, and mathematical notation for the numerical results of measurements. These may be called the material necessities of science. So, Hodgson is basically saying that science requires a stable society where people can focus on ideas, along with some basic technologies, writing, and math, so that they can share the results of their experiments. But many ancient civilizations had these requirements. The Egyptians constructed pyramids. Might have been aliens. But the Chinese developed gunpowder and printing. The Romans engineered aqueducts. History is rich with technological achievements across many cultures. Yet, scientific revolution brought something distinct. It was a systematic investigation of nature. So what set Western Europe during this time apart? What was the key difference? Numerous historians from the 20th century to today point out a particular intellectual factor. The assumptions that Western Europeans held about nature and humanity that was the X factor, that was the difference. And these beliefs, which fueled the scientific revolution, were deeply rooted in biblical Christian principles. Let's explore 3 of the core assumptions or beliefs about nature, which helped fuel this scientific revolution. First would be the intelligibility of nature. They believed nature was crafted by a purposeful mind, God, and thus bore a design that humans could comprehend. As one author put it, the reason within matches the reason without. So in other words, the same hand that crafted our mind and our ability to reason crafted the world in a way that our minds could comprehend it. This seems intuitive now, that nature can be understood by the human mind. But that intuition is largely due to the wild success that science has enjoyed. Historically, though, that was an extremely rare belief. Many cultures viewed nature as chaotic, especially those with multiple gods. Gods were pulling in different directions, arguing with one another, fighting for human attention and affection. The biblical concept of humans being made in God's image provided a unique theological foundation for believing nature was understandable and a motivation, therefore, to study it. And so the second assumption about nature is very closely related to the first. It's the order of nature. This builds on that first point, but nature exhibits an order and a regularity, what we often call natural laws, gravity, Newton's laws of motion, etc. The Christian society which birthed the scientific revolution saw these laws as God's way of governing his creation. Robert Boyle, who is a figure that we're going to revisit shortly, he expressed it this way: "'Tis nature, like a rare clock, all things so skillfully contrived, that the engine being set once a-moving, all things proceed according to the artificer's design." What is he saying? Boyle likens nature to a clock. Once set in motion by God, it runs according to his original plan. The third assumption is the contingency of nature. I'll explain what contingency is. But the Greeks also recognized the order that existed in nature, but they saw it as inevitable, stemming from a logical principle called the logos. So they assumed, for instance, that the celestial orbits all must be perfect circles, because a circle was the most logical shape. In contrast, the Christian worldview of the scientific revolution held that nature's order was contingent. In other words, it was chosen by God, who could have designed it differently. This notion of God's free sovereignty over creation meant that humans couldn't just sit in their armchairs and deduce how nature should be based on what seemed logical. We actually had to go out and observe it, see how it actually was. And since human reasoning is fallible, we have to test those ideas against reality. And this concept became essential. So these 3 ideas, nature's intelligibility, nature's order and regularity, as well as the contingency of nature paired with our own fallenness and fallibility, flowed directly from Christian theology and laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution. Stephen C. Meyer is a contemporary author. If you really like to read, his books focus primarily on these subjects, and he's phenomenal. I really like his work, but they're thick. They're thick books. All right. He has this to say: "The first thing to say is that science did not arise because of a set of naturalistic presuppositions. It actually arose because of a conviction that there was a lawful order in nature, that human beings could discern and understand it because they'd been made in the image of the creator of that order. There were a number of ways in which Christianity gave rise to modern science, and the idea that a set of naturalistic assumptions is necessary to do science is just historically false." He uses the word naturalism a few times. If you don't know what that is, it is a philosophical view that everything arises from natural causes, and it rejects all supernatural explanations. So basically, everything is just stuff. If it's not material, it doesn't exist. That's the view from the naturalistic perspective. And Stephen Meyer is saying that science actually grew from a Christian belief in an orderly and understandable nature, not from the rejection of God, such as from a naturalistic viewpoint. Okay, let's look at some key figures from the scientific revolution, see what they had to say. Johannes Kepler, 17th century astronomer and famous for his laws of planetary motion, he said this: "I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him, since we astronomers are priests of the highest God. In regard to the book of nature, it benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our mind, but rather, above all else, the glory of God." Robert Boyle, often hailed as the father of modern chemistry, he said this: "From a knowledge of his work, we shall know him." This longer quote, he says this: "That the consideration of the vastness, beauty, and regular motions of the heavenly bodies, the excellent structure of animals and plants, besides a multitude of other phenomena of nature, and the subserviency of most of these to man, may just induce him, as a rational creature, to conclude that this vast, beautiful, orderly, and, in a word, many ways admirable system of things that we call the world was framed by an author supremely powerful, wise, and good, can scarce be denied by an intelligent and unprejudiced considerer. And this is strongly confirmed by experience, which witnesseth that in almost all ages and countries the generality of philosophers and contemplative men were persuaded of the existence of a deity by the consideration of the phenomena of the universe." That's a lot. What is he saying? Boyle is arguing that nature's grandeur and its utility suggest a purposeful design by a powerful, wise, good creator. And this is a viewpoint that he argues most thoughtful people throughout history have shared. And then there's Isaac Newton, a titan, polymath. This man did a lot of things. He has a few choice words as well. Gravity may put the planets into motion, but without the divine power, it could never put them into such a circulating motion as they have about the sun. And therefore, for this as well as other reasons, I am compelled to ascribe the frame of this system to an intelligent agent. A heavenly master governs all the world as sovereign of the universe. We are astonished by him by reason of his perfection. We honor him and fall down before him because of his unlimited power. From blind physical necessity, which is always and everywhere the same, no variety adhering to time and place could evolve. And all variety of created objects, which represent order and life in the universe, could happen only by the willful reasoning of its original creator, whom I call the Lord God. And finally, my favorite, all of my discoveries have been made in answer to prayer. There is so much more that could be said here. And I encourage you, if this is interesting to you, do more reading, more research. This is in no way meant to be comprehensive. I hope to provide you with many trailheads where you can learn as you wish. So the point, rather than obstructing scientific progress, belief in God propelled it. And for the fathers of modern science, science wasn't something that hindered their faith. Rather, it was a distinctly Christian worldview that made their scientific achievements possible. It's actually striking that the very aspects of nature that once pointed so clearly to God for some of history's greatest minds are now cited as reasons to reject him. So science fails to account for everything. Here's a reflection from a 1960 Nobel Prize winner in physiology and medicine, Sir Peter Medawar, Dr. Medawar. He's recognized primarily for his work in immunology and is regarded the father of modern transplantation. So he focused primarily on organ transplants. The existence of a limit to science, however, is made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with first and last things. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? Dr. Medawar here is highlighting that science can't address fundamental questions about origin or purpose, despite its impressive power in other areas. One source of the perceived conflict between God and science is, in fact, a misconception about God. Many imagine him to be like a pagan deity, invoked to explain some unknown phenomena, right? Like the god of thunder. It's a thing we don't understand, so we create a God for it. And this is known as the God of the gaps fallacy. And it's the idea that once science explains thunder, our gap in understanding is closed and the God becomes unnecessary. Poof, gone. If that's your view of God, the God of the Bible, then yes, science and faith might be at odds. But the God of Scripture is not a gap filler. Genesis declares that he has created everything and repeatedly reaffirms that he not only created but sustains everything, both known and unknown. And as the pioneers of the scientific revolution understood, it's the parts that we do understand that point most powerfully to God. Another misconception, though, on the other hand, is a misconception which applies to science. Many believe that science can or will explain everything, given enough time. Many assume that all gaps in human knowledge are solvable through the scientific method, and only what's scientifically provable is worth accepting. Quick question. I don't have a ton of time, but my question is this. Are there questions that science can't explain? If so, what comes to mind? Any ideas? Not all at once, guys. Okay. That's all right. I'll let you off the hook. Please, go ahead.
I'm thinking long and hard.
Don't think too long or too hard. All right. Let me, I'll summarize this quote quickly. So Karl Jaspers is a German-Swiss philosopher and psychiatrist. His work had a very strong influence on the modern practice of psychiatry, but also he's considered an important representative of existential philosophy. But he had this to say, based on his work in psychiatry, the limits of science have always been the source of bitter disappointment when people expect something from science that it was not able to provide. Take the following examples, and he lists several. One, a man without faith, seeking to find in science a substitute for his faith on which to build his life. He lists others, but concluding with this, disenchantment inevitably follows upon these and similar misconceptions. One question remains, what value can science possibly have when its limitations have become so painfully clear? Jaspers here is warning against expecting science to answer life's deepest questions, like faith, ultimate truth. He suggests doing so inevitably leads to disillusionment when it falls short. Okay, so to answer the question, what can't science prove? This is part of a discourse that occurred during a debate. This debate happened between Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. Peter Atkins. William Lane Craig is a very well-known Christian philosopher and apologist. And then Dr. Peter Atkins is a chemist, and he was representing the atheist perspective. And to the question from Dr. Atkins of, so you deny that science can account for everything? William Lane Craig had this to say. I'll try to go through this quickly. Yes, I do deny that science can account for everything. I think there are a good number of things that science that cannot be scientifically proven, but that we're all rational to accept. Let me list 5. Logical and mathematical truths cannot be proven by science. Science presupposes logic and math, so that to try to prove them by science, we'd be arguing in a circle. Metaphysical truths, like there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past was not created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age, are all rational beliefs that cannot be scientifically proven. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible by the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists at the camps did anything evil as opposed to scientists in Western democracies. Aesthetic judgments, number 4, cannot be accessed by the scientific method because the beautiful, like the good, cannot be scientifically proven. And finally, most remarkably, would be science itself. Science cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is permeated with unprovable assumptions. For example, in the special theory of relativity, the whole theory hinges on the assumption that the speed of light is a constant in a one-way direction moving between 2 points, A and B. But that strictly cannot be proven. We simply have to assume that that is the case in order to hold to the theory. So none of these beliefs can be scientifically proven, and yet they are accepted by all of us, and we are rational in doing so. So, to summarize, Craig lists things that are beyond the reach of science, like logic, the reality of other minds, morality, beauty, and even science's own foundations. Yet, he argues, we are rational to accept these things, despite science's inability to prove them. If you hold to a position that reality is purely material, again, naturalism, there's no basis for trusting the very reasoning that science depends on. Okay, so why does science fall short of disproving Christianity? Far from disproving Christianity, science often leans on ideas that have been borrowed, like we've argued, from a Christian worldview. Take the uniformity of nature. Science assumes a universe that operates consistently, an idea echoing the biblical portrayal of God as faithful and unchanging in Malachi 3:6, I, the Lord, do not change. This assumption isn't proven by science. It's a starting point for conducting science and aligns with Christian theology. Science's very foundation then rests on concepts it can't disprove without undermining the validity of the scientific process itself. Moreover, science doesn't have the tools to disprove Christianity because science's tools of observation and measurement are built for the natural world, not the supernatural. Christianity claims a God who transcends nature, its cause rather than its subject. The resurrection of Jesus, the core of Christian belief, is a historical event which natural science can't test. History is a field which falls outside of the natural sciences. It's not that science disproves it, it's that science isn't equipped to weigh in any more than it can measure love or consciousness. Recent discoveries even bolster this point. The fine-tuning of the universe, for example, with its precise constants allowing life. We're going to go over that a little bit more in just a moment. This has struck scientists like Fred Hoyle. He's the British astrophysicist who actually coined the term the Big Bang. The fine-tuning of the universe strikes him as very improbably calibrated. He says this, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The number one calculates from the facts seems to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. I'll try to demonstrate that momentarily. This doesn't exactly prove God, but it fits the Christian idea of purposeful design and shows that scientific pursuit can and has stirred up faith for many rather than erasing it. In fact, faith persists among scientists. Just in 2009, a Pew study found that 51% of American scientists profess a belief in God or a higher power. Francis Collins, he was the gentleman who led the Human Genome Project. He sees DNA's complexity as evidence of purposeful intelligence. He said this, the God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. All of this challenges the gross overreach that scientism has enjoyed in our modern time. Scientism is a false belief that science is the only valid form of knowledge, which, by the way, isn't a scientific finding, it's a philosophy, and it's a shaky one, because science cannot justify excluding non-material truths. Christianity offers a much broader lens, reason, revelation, experience, that science cannot dismiss. Science explains the how, but leaves why unanswered. Okay, before we wrap up, I want to take just a moment to go back and talk about fine-tuning. You may not know what all these things are on this next slide, but I'm going to list a few of the things that if they were not precisely tuned, or if they varied by the amounts indicated here, would result in zero life anywhere ever. Here we go. If the gravitational constant were a trillionth more or less, if the strong nuclear force were a hundredth off, if the weak nuclear force shifted by a thousandth, the electromagnetic force budged by a millionth, the speed of light varied by a billionth, Planck's constant twitched by a 10,000th, the proton's mass was different by a trillionth, the neutron's mass differed by a billionth, the electron's mass off by a millionth, the electron charge changed by a thousandth, proton to electron mass ratio shifted by a hundredth, if the cosmological constant deviated by a quintrillionth, the early universe's entropy spiked by a trillionth, the universe's density fluctuated a billionth, if the expansion rate altered by a millionth, if the fine structure constant moved a 10,000th, if carbon's resonance level drifted a 1,000th, oxygen's resonance a 100th, the star distances shrank by a trillionth, if Earth's distance from our own sun varied by a billionth, Earth's axial tilt tilted by a millionth, if Earth's magnetic field weakened by a 1,000th, if the Earth's crust was thickened by a 100th, if the atmosphere's mix shifted by a trillionth, if water's specific heat dropped by a billionth, if Jupiter's gravitational field faded by a millionth, if the moon's stabilizing effect waned by a thousandths, the odds of all of these constants aligning by pure chance is 1 to the 10 to the 244th power. Here's a visual representation of that.
Oh, yay, numbers.
This is a number so vast that it dwarfs the estimated number of the atoms in the universe, which is 10 to the 80th. This is the cosmic odds you're dealing with that make life here possible and sustainable. Science is remarkable, but limited. It dissects the world to understand its mechanisms. Religion weaves it together to explore its meaning. You're looking at something. If every atom in the universe flipped a coin 244 times and those coins landed on heads every single time, multiply those odds by a trillion, 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 trillion.
Gosh.
Those are the odds. Doesn't prove God exactly. It's a little convincing though. I think C.S. Lewis put it very beautifully, far more eloquently than I could. He said, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. To insist that we should only accept what science can prove is to take a leap of the blindest faith, because the claim itself cannot be scientifically verified. God exists beyond the universe. He transcends it. He permeates it and is unaffected by it. Demanding that he be proven solely through scientific means misunderstands both science's scope and God's nature. It assumes an all-powerful science while wrongly assuming a limited God." Thank you for coming.